When you ask evolutionists what is some of the strong evidence for evolution, one of the things that they'll point out is that the universality of the DNA code is strong evidence for common ancestry and evolution. What they don't realize is that they are making a religious argument with that. And I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter. He's a biophysicist and has also spent so much time studying philosophy and history related to evolution and trying to understand what is going on with this absurd theory. How did we get here? And so Dr. Hunter is going to take us through and show us how the universality of the DNA code, why it's problematic actually, and then why it's actually a religious argument. So thanks for being here, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Great to be here again. And we're doing the 6-part series. And the first 4 we've done were on categories. There was the nested hierarchy, there was homology, there was small scale evolution, and embryology. So those are all categories of evidence for evolution that within them have these slam dunk arguments, powerful arguments for evolution. However, when you look at the science, they fail, but yet evolutionists don't miss a beat. That doesn't seem to affect their arguments, even though they fail badly on the science. In fact, the science challenges and refutes, contradicts the theory of evolution. So you have this weird thing of why are they not coming clean on this? And it turns out, well, that was never their argument. Their argument was always from a religious perspective. The evidence, the observables violate what we would expect from a nice, benevolent creator.
Now, when people hear this, that sounds very weird to them. Most people are thinking in terms of evolution is a scientific theory. What is this guy talking about? How is this religious? No, this is wrong. So we have done this is, I think, the 5th part in this series that we've done. Yes. So we have lots of other videos that are discussing the religious arguments for evolution. So please do check those out. They are in a playlist on my channel. So if you scroll down on my homepage, you'll see them. So thanks, Dr. Hunter.
Absolutely. And in each one of those, again, there was a 3-step process, a 3-step sequence, powerful evidence, unfortunately refuted dramatically by the science, but it persisted anyway because that was never the argument. It was religious. So there was the claim, there was the failure of the claim, and there was the persistence of the claim, and we looked at that. We'll see that same 3-step process again today. So instead of looking at a category of evidence, today we'll look at one of the poster child evidences, one of the classic best evidences for common descent and evolution. That is the genetic code. Now, the genetic code is used to make proteins in our cells. This protein synthesis uses this code. It happens according to a code. And for evolutionists, this is just very powerful proof of common descent and evolution. It's this just widely claimed, it's probably the most celebrated single evidence for common descent and evolution today. It was discovered back in the 1960s. So right after the structure of the DNA code was discovered, they then parsed out the code, the genetic code itself. And Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate and co-founder of the DNA structure, jumped right into this code and wrote prolifically on the findings of this code and what they meant and everything. And very smart guy, and interesting books and papers that he wrote. But he said, given what we now understand about this genetic code, quote, one must assume common descent. One must assume common descent. That was his statement, and that has stuck. So ever since Crick, that has been a very celebrated, no question about it, proof text of common descent and evolution. There are 2 main observables that really underwrite this claim. And so, Rebecca, you mentioned universality. So that's one of them, that the code, the genetic code is universal. That is, it's used in all the species. There are tens of millions of species in the biosphere, and they all use this same genetic code. And there's no reason for it So you have it's this incredible homology. Evolutionists are always looking for similarities between species as evidence of evolution. These similarities, they say, came from a common ancestor. So if a similarity comes from a common ancestor, it's called a homology. Well, this was the ultimate homology because it's in all of the species. It's not just in a few. It's not just in the mammals or the fish or something. It's in all species. So it comes from the common ancestor of all species. And what a great evidence, what a great proof that there was this common ancestor, and the DNA, the genetic code was in that common ancestor billions of years ago. And then our extant species have inherited it from that. So the ultimate homology because it's universal. The other observable that is fundamental and a pillar behind this claim is that it's mundane. There's nothing special about the genetic code. The genetic code, like the Morse, think of the Morse code, it uses dots and dashes to represent letters in the English language. And it's a good code, but you could imagine different codes. It could have been done differently. There's many, many different codes that could have been created to represent the English language. Same thing with the genetic code. There's astronomical number of possible codes that could have been used. This code that we find seems to be just, according to evolutionists, one of many, just kind of picked out from the crowd. Nothing special about it, an arbitrary code. It's just, a random code, a rando, just one code of many. Nothing special about it. So it's mundane and it's universal. Those are the two observables that fuel this incredible claim, this celebration of evolutionists, because on the one hand, the code itself, because it's mundane, there's no reason for it. It could have been any other code. And because it's universal, there's no reason for it to be universal. And that just proves that it just illustrates the common descent pattern so well, the ultimate homology. So no reason for it to be mundane, no reason for it to be universal, yet it is universal. Why would that be? And why this code? So two very powerful claims, and I have papers on this with quotes from textbooks and popular books after Crick, making these same sorts of statements that this is just, hard over, no question about it, proof of evolution and common descent.
Yeah. Okay. So let me kind of like recap that in simple terms. Okay. You pick up any plant, it's going to have this same DNA code. Any animal, look at it. It's going to have the DNA code. Look at the bacteria. It's going to have this DNA code. So all of life is using this same code. And hey, they're saying, wow, what better proof that we came from a common ancestor, because otherwise, why would we all have this same code? That's just couldn't happen by chance. It couldn't happen. There's nothing that forced the code to be that way. So that's why it's such powerful evidence that we all came from a common ancestor.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Rebecca. So when we actually look at the science now, and let's just drop everything about whether we're evolutionists or we're not evolutionists, we're creationists, just drop all that. Let's just all agree that we believe in the science and we can speak the same language, the same scientific language. And we ought to be able to agree on the scientific findings and the inferences and the deductions entailed therein. So we should all agree on what I'm about to say right now, because I have 6 refutations of this claim. Refutations of the claim that the DNA, that the genetic code is powerful evidence for common descent and evolution. But also these 6 reasons are actually contradictions to the theory itself. They challenge, they are a major problem. They present a major problem for the theory of evolution. So it's not just refutation of a positive argument, it's actually a problem. This is all a major problem. So these claims that the genetic code is such powerful evidence for evolution have actually converted a major problem and made it into a shining star. Well, I'm going to show you why that conversion is false. So number one, the first problem is, now remember when we said it is the same in all the species, and therefore it has to come from the common ancestor. That common ancestor was billions of years ago. So if you think about it, evolution in those billions of years crossed vast amounts of evolutionary territory. You created multicellular life, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. Incredible changes happening because evolution created all these things. But yet it couldn't change the code. It didn't change the code. It was a mundane code, never changed. So therefore, it must be unevolvable. This is just a deduction and inference from evolutionary thinking. It has to be unevolvable. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the same code across all the species. That's why you have all these differences in between all the species, because evolution is doing its thing. It's creating all of these things, all of these differences. When you see something that doesn't change, it's the same in all the species, it's got to be rock hard. It cannot be evolvable. That is fundamental to evolutionary thinking here. If it is found to be evolvable, that would be a deal breaker for evolution. So it can't evolve. Okay, so far so good. However, wait a minute. Let's think about this for a second. This is going to raise a problem, because if it's unevolvable, then what? How did it evolve in the first place? So there's no principled reason why this conclusion that it's unevolvable would not apply to the evolution of the code prior to that first ancestor, that last ancestor that had the code. It had to evolve before that to get to the evolutionary, to get to the genetic code. So you have a problem that it's unevolvable, then how did it come about?
Well, would they? I feel like their response to that would be, well, that's a problem for abiogenesis. That's a problem for the first life. So that's not a problem we have to deal with. That doesn't have to do with evolution.
That is often a kind of way to sweep things under the rug, try and sweep things under the rug. First of all, origin of life is not a separate problem. But second of all, this is after the origin of life. So this goes up to your last universal common ancestor, which is well after the origin of life event or events. So no, you can't, even if you were to agree that, yeah, origin of life is a different category, it doesn't work. This is post origin of life. So that's problem number one. If it's unevolvable, then it's unevolvable. You can't just have your cake and eat it too. Now, there's another separate reason why it is unevolvable, a completely different reason, and that is just the complexity of the code. The code has several steps that are used to enact the code, to create this code. It's a very complicated thing at the molecular level. If you look at actually how it happens, very, very complicated with a lot of moving parts. Now, again, as I said, what's the purpose of the code? The code is used to synthesize proteins. So you need a protein, you need a particular protein, you need a globin protein. Okay, you make it, and it's created according to the genetic code. So it's used to create proteins. Well, the problem is there is a small army of proteins needed to enact the genetic code. So just doing protein synthesis and enacting the genetic code requires proteins. So wait a minute, you needed the code is used to make proteins, but you need proteins already to enact the code. You see how that's circular? Which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? This is a problem. And so evolutionary theory falls apart on those sorts of problems. Evolution needs to have a gradualistic narrative where just complexity just kind of gradually arises fortuitously. And that doesn't work with so much of biology. And this is a great example of that in the genetic code. It's not that kind of a narrative. It's not that kind of a system, not that kind of a structure. It needs to have something different than evolution if you're going to talk about how this arose. Evolution just doesn't work for this problem. It's like you're using a screwdriver, to do where you need a hammer. It's just using a screwdriver to try and pound something in. It doesn't work. Evolution doesn't work on this kind of a problem. It's too complex. One evolutionist wrote, "It's a mind-bogglingly complicated process." I love that quote. It's a mind-bogglingly complicated process. That was in a peer-reviewed journal paper. So yeah, and that's true. It is a mind-bogglingly complicated process. So it's not surprising that evolutionists have failed in their attempt to come up with a explanation of how it evolved. That's, of course, of interest to evolutionists. Of course, that's a project for evolutionists, would be to describe how did the DNA, the genetic code, evolve. And that's a really big problem. It's an unsolved problem for evolutionists. They've tried and tried and tried for many years and kind of thrown up their hands. And one evolutionist said, to be honest, we are stuck. We're not able to solve this problem. Of course, now, by the way, I'm not talking about a mutation by mutation description of the tens of thousands of mutations that would be required by a random process. How did this, step by step? I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about a phenomenological level, like at a very high level, or cartoon level, where you just, trying to describe what parts, what the moving parts were and how this came together. Evolutionists have been flatly failed on this project of the simplest, at the simplest level. They've been unable to do that because there's just too many problems. It doesn't work out. So the first problem was it's not evolvable because it must be not evolvable because of the universality. The universality from an evolutionary perspective forces you to conclude that it's not evolvable. But then also it's not evolvable simply because it's way beyond the capture of random mutations and natural selection. It's just evolution can't do that sort of a problem. So that's problem number two. But to be honest, we are stuck. Now, problem number three, remember, we said it's not, it's mundane. It's arbitrary. It's one, if you had to think about a stadium full of people, thousands, tens of thousands of people in the stadium, you just click out one person, it's going to be an average guy, average height, average weight, just an average guy. That's how the code is envisioned. It's just an average code, an arbitrary code, nothing special. Well, the evolutionists kind of should have known that wasn't quite right from the very beginning, because even a casual inspection of the code, you can see there's an interesting structure going on. You can see right away it's not random. It's not obvious what it is, but it's obvious that it's not random. There's something going on with the genetic code. It's obvious right from the start. Well, in 1998, a paper came out entitled "The Genetic Code is 1 in a Million." So that kind of gives you an idea. This is a special code. It's 1 in a million. Now, they were talking about its error correcting capabilities, error correcting features. And so that when you have mutations, it tends to suppress the effects of the mutations. There's a lot of other capacities of the code, other layers of the code that researchers have uncovered. And a few years later, that 1 in a million, this is like maybe 15 years later, maybe 20 years, that 1 in a million number was upgraded to 10 to the 20th. So in other words, 100 million. The code is 1 in 100 million instead of 1 in a million. So it just keeps on getting bigger as the inexorable progress of science marches on. We just find out more and more tricks and up its sleeve, and the code is very special. So the mundane finding, maybe I should say assumption, but that pillar, that fundamental idea that this claim that the genetic code is powerful evidence for evolution, there were two fundamental pillars. One of them was that it's mundane. Absolutely failed. So that's a problem. Now, another problem, what was the other pillar? It was universal. So how did that fare? Well, it turns out that also failed. It's not universal. And one reason why it's not universal is because the machinery is not universal. So when we talk about the code, there's kind of two things. One is the code itself, and then the other is the machinery that enacts the code. And the machinery that enacts the code includes a bunch of things. So one of them are a very special class of protein that really is at the core of enacting the code. It's called the amino acyl tRNA synthetases. Now, you don't need to remember that name, but there are these cool, important proteins that are enacting the code. those proteins are, you find those proteins in all the different species. And so evolutionists have called that out as, see, it's not just the code itself, it's the machinery also. And the machinery is part of the claim. So the claim is not just that the code is universal, but the code's machinery is universal. The molecular machinery that has been hailed, celebrated. Niles Eldredge, Michael Ruse, and others have celebrated that as important part of that claim that it's universal. Well, that's false, because if you actually look under the hood and you look at these amino acid tRNA synthetases proteins, at the actual amino acid sequences of them, and compare them across the species, they don't line up at all. They don't fit the common descent pattern radically. And this isn't just some minor little, well, okay, a few more mutations happened. No, these are radical problems, radical changes. So I mentioned that 1998 paper on the 1 in a million code. About that same time, give or take a few years, another paper came out of the University of Illinois by Carl Woese and Gary Olson and coworkers on this problem that the machinery is not universal. And they really, it's a very good paper. And by the way, I sat in on Gary's comp bio class at the time, so I know a little bit about it. He went over that very nicely. And it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And that's evidenced in this paper, where they not only did they illustrate that these proteins are not homologous, the protein sequences are not homologous, they do not fit the common descent pattern, but they tried to solve the problem. And they said, this is what it's going to take. And so it was a good paper. They really tried to solve the problem from an evolutionary perspective and show, okay, here's what probably happened or could have happened to create these radically different amino acid sequences. And they came up with all kinds of wild solutions that they presented seriously because they had to. One of them was horizontal gene transfer on steroids. It was just a horizontal gene transfer that's going crazy and doing all these unique one-off things here and there, and then it changes and it speeds up and it slows down and this and that. So they're just using horizontal gene transfer creatively to solve the problem. And it's kind of a tautology, whatever we find, horizontal gene transfer did that. But that alone was not enough. They also had to invoke other radical mechanisms. One of them was that the entire biological world shifted, and in a certain point in time, things just changed. The nature of biological cells changed. So it's just, you can see this is not working at all from an evolutionary perspective. So this is the sign of a theory that isn't working, when the complexity is being ratcheted up higher and higher and higher. Complexity is the death knell of scientific theories. You cannot have complexity. Ask any data science researcher. You cannot do that. That'll kill you. So that's what evolution has engaged in big time on steroids. Just the complexity is off the charts. It's worse than the tax code. So that's another. So it's not universal because the machinery is not universal. It absolutely failed on this universality claim. But there's another reason. So going to the next problem, there's another reason why it's not universal. So it's always been known, or for a long time, it's been known that there are these minor variants to the code. They're pretty rare in the entire scheme of things. It's only a handful of species and a handful of these variants. These are not different codes altogether. It's like one little change in the code. It's still the genetic code. It's obvious. No one would disagree. This is the genetic code. But yes, it is. They're called variants. And there are some people who claim that, well, that violates universality. And others say, no, you maybe could evolve that somehow, So I think that's a debatable. But I won't get into that debate because it's a moot point. It doesn't matter, because there are a couple of other codes that are different codes. They are significantly, substantially different. They fall into the category of expansionist codes. So these are not minor little tweaks where one little thing is just tweaked. This is the addition of another amino acid. So normally the standard genetic code uses 20 amino acids. Well, these expansionist codes have 21. So they've added an amino acid to the complement of amino acids.
So does that kind of destroy the code is not evolvable idea?
Well, that's you're anticipating the next step.
Okay.
Let me table that one for 1 second, because I want to make crystal clear that that the unevolvable claim goes out the window. You cannot say it's unevolvable. With the variants, you could still argue it's unevolvable. These are minor variants, not a big deal. They don't really harm our understanding of the code as unevolvable. You cannot say that with these expansionist codes. The expansionist codes are substantial differences. Yes, you still do have, it looks a lot like the standard genetic code. It's aside from the added amino acid, everything else is the same as the standard genetic code. But adding that one amino acid is a big change. You have to add a lot of things. There's a lot of molecular machinery has to be added and adjusted. It's not just one or two mutations that could have caused this. Whereas the variants, you could imagine a modest few mutations could have enacted that. Whether that would make it lethal or not is another question, because remember, that was one of the arguments for evolution. You had the universality of the code, and all those billions of years it didn't evolve. What they argued was any change would have been lethal. That was one of the justifications. Yeah, it makes sense that it's universal, that it's in all the species, because whatever was in that common ancestor, if it ever evolved, that would be lethal. So I think I forgot to mention that, but that was another one of the arguments that they use, and it kind of makes sense. So you would have it can't evolve, but then if it can't evolve, then how did it evolve in the first place? So we went over that. Well, now we are finding, wait a minute, now we have a change, and this is not just a variant. The variants themselves, you could wonder about that. Wait a minute, wouldn't that be lethal? And so evolutionists have to argue, no, this could come about by a mutation or two, and these are modest changes that wouldn't be lethal. That's a dubious argument, but in the expansionist case, it just goes out the window. So again, it's a moot point. I don't want to talk about the variants because they are a moot point. The expansionist codes are the death knell. They demolish the idea that it's unevolvable and that it's universal. So, it's a twofer. You get it's obviously not universal. With the variants, okay, maybe that those can slide by. Not the expansionist codes. These are major changes. A lot of changes have to happen to the molecular machinery, not just one or two mutations. So you can't say it's universal, and then you can't say it's unevolvable. So another huge problem with these expansionist codes. Now, there's another problem with the expansionist codes, and that is that they are convergently, they appear convergently in the evolutionary tree. They don't, what you'd like is to say, well, it's just the bacteria, it's just the archaea, it's this clade, it's, the frogs have it, nobody else. It's not the way. Again, we see this over and over and over again in evolutionary theory. It's sprinkled about sporadically appearing, as one evolutionist put it, sporadically appearing in the evolutionary tree. So not only is this like super difficult to evolve because you had to take all these changes to the molecular machinery, but it happened again and again and again, there and there within the archaea, for example. It's one of the codes occurs primarily in the archaea, but within the archaea, it's just sprinkled around. And so why is that happening from an evolutionary perspective? That makes no sense. So monumental refutations and contradictions to evolutionary theory from the expansionist codes. Again, everything I'm saying here is completely uncontroversial. This is just scientific evidence, scientific observables, and the deductions and inferences entailed therein. So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. It's a good breaking point.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to make it clear for the audience. Look, this is one of the major problems when you're dealing with the theory of evolution. So the theory is, right, that we all evolved and there's all these changes going on, right? And so but they're saying that okay, the universality of the DNA code is evidence that we all came from a common ancestor. So and they're saying it didn't evolve because it couldn't evolve. But now we're seeing examples of it evolving, and so now it's like, okay, well, hey, that's evolution. So no matter what happens, they'll always say it's evolution. So if it changes, hey, that's evolution. If it doesn't change, hey, that's evolution. It's all evolution. No matter what we see, it will be evolution. And in their minds, that's okay. We're just doing science. But it is not, this is not a scientific approach. And I think that's what we're about to get into right now.
They do that because they believe evolution is true. So
Right.
if you know something is true, that changes the entire ballgame, right? You're going to believe it's any problems are just simply grounds for further research, right?
Right. And that's the state, like, if you want to understand, like, what's going on here, that's what's going on. People have believed evolution is true, and scientists have been indoctrinated throughout their studies, right? That evolution is true. So no matter what we find, it doesn't even crack. They don't get any doubt about evolution. They just see it as a new problem to solve.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but why? Why? Where did we get this idea that
We're
evolution must be true?
we're getting there, but one more, and that is, remember we talked about it's the code is universal, and there's no reason for it. So that was back at the slam dunk arguments for evolution, the mundaneness and universality. We've seen both of those have failed, but there's another problem, and that is the entire notion that there's no reason for its universality is a monumentally unscientific. I could. I'm trying to be polite here. It's ridiculous, absurd. Those sorts of words are appropriate here. It is a ridiculous idea, and yet it has been the textbook idea ever since Crick, and evolutionists since then have repeated this idea, this claim, this belief that there's no reason for the universality. You have universality, but why should it be that way? Well, of course it has to be universal. This is like pretty obvious biology. Like there is a lot of genetic transfer between species, including protein coding genes or fragments thereof, and those would have to be. Those won't make any sense if the receiving organism doesn't have the same code. So if I'm going to give you a message, you better have the same code that I used to write it, right? So you have horizontal gene transfer. Ironically, we just looked at how horizontal gene transfer was misused dramatically, but horizontal gene transfer is a thing. It does happen. There's a lot of genetic transfer in the biosphere. You've got these organisms in the biosphere. At any given point in time, you've got how many organisms in the biosphere? A lot, but this is kind of fluid transfer. The genetic material is kind of a fluid thing, existing both within the organisms, but also kind of floating around between them. So the genetic material is something different than just the organisms. So the organisms have to have the same code in order for this to work. I mean, biology wouldn't work without a universal genetic code. The idea is just beyond ridiculous. It's very saddening and disappointing to see such a monumental, fundamental scientific mistake, if I can call it that, a mistake or blindness or something is going on with the evolutionists. But this is what you get with evolution is all kinds of these 6 points that I've gone through have shown all kinds of really off the charts, silly, ridiculous thing that evolution is forced to say and do. So this is another one that Oh, yeah, there was no reason for the universality. Well, that's a very powerful idea, whether it's true or not. And there's an attraction to that idea. The attraction is the principle of plenitude and principle of sufficient reason. So a lot of these arguments are from plenitude. And I know scientists have never heard of that, but plenitude is an idea that God, a good God, would create the fullest world possible. And so anytime you see a constraint, a pattern in the world that there's no reason for, then that's evident that God didn't do it that way. God wouldn't have created that. Think of it as a capricious God. Let's say that there's a DNA code, a genetic code, and let's say it's mundane. Let's say it's arbitrary. Let's say there's no reason for it. I'm going by the evolutionist claims here, just as a thought experiment. Just let's consider that possibility and put yourself in the evolutionist shoes. There's this genetic code. There's no reason for it. And it's universal. There's no reason for it. Would God have done that? Think about it. I don't think most creationists would like that idea. Why would God, if it really is an arbitrary code, just take that seriously for a moment. Take that idea seriously and evaluate that in your mind. Would you be comfortable with God creating and using a genetic code that is arbitrary? Because that sounds capricious.
Well, I don't have a problem with it. I don't feel the weight of this argument, but I know a lot of people do. And I've heard a lot of evolutionists use this argument, even evolutionists who don't believe in God. And they will say,
Right,
why would God do that?
And that's an internal contradiction, because if they don't believe in God, they can't make that argument, but that's another story. But many of them do believe in God, and they use that argument. So plenitude is a theistic argument going back to antiquity. It has been a very powerful argument for hundreds of years. So the idea is you have to establish no sufficient reason, and then you have to establish yet it's constrained, yet it doesn't fill everything up. So centuries ago, the belief was it is filled. For example, when we look at the species, they seem to have specific points in the space of the design space. We don't see a continuum of species, right? We see isolated, discrete species. Well, naturalists hundreds of years ago believed that as the explorers go around the world and uncover more and more species and fossils and everything, that will fill in. That there is a continuum of species. We just don't see it yet. So it's a sampling problem. It's not an ontological problem. There has to be a continuum of species. And one such thinker, one of my guy I kind of like, is Gottfried Leibniz. So Leibniz insisted there has to be this continuum of species, such that you can't slip a piece of paper between them. It's just they're that close. So you cannot hardly distinguish. Which sounds a lot like calculus, by the way, and he was the co-founder of calculus. So I think that kind of got into his head a little bit. But the plenitude idea that it has to be full. The world must be full because God is good. And the Bible tells us God is good. So this is a very theological idea, and it makes its way into cosmological evolution, and it makes its way into biological evolution. And today it is the most powerful theological argument for evolution, hands down, no question about it. It is the argument that makes for the astronomical claims that evolution must be true. The contemporary papers out that are making these claims are based on plenitude arguments. And this is another plenitude argument, that the DNA code wouldn't be the same throughout the entire biosphere. It would be varied. Now, we just talked about how it has to be the same code. You can't, the idea that, so the principle of sufficient reason goes out the window. The idea that there's no sufficient reason for a universal code, no, of course there's a sufficient reason. The organisms have to be able to trade genetic material, including protein coding genetic material. So you have to have the same code. Of course you do. that silliness nonetheless persists. And that just kind of illustrates the power of religion and where we are with science, that science is being led around by the nose by religion to the point of ignoring these, very obvious scientific problems. So you just have this silliness going on. So it's a lot like the emperor's new clothes, where these people are just oh no, it's a beautiful outfit that the evolution that the emperor has. What a beautiful outfit, when he doesn't have anything on at all. They're just making these ridiculous claims. And so now we're to, why is this persisting? I've just went through 6 major killer problems for this idea that the genetic code is evidence for evolution. And in fact, not only is that, but it presents problems for evolution on the whole. This is a refutation of evolution. A refutation, a contradiction, has been converted into this powerful evidence for evolution, but it's all false. You have the theory does not work. It fails. If you are an evolutionist, you are without excuse. You have no excuse for this because it's so obvious. This is not, I'm not digging down to some like super subtle, quantum mechanics. You have to understand, you have to have, graduate level math or something. This is pretty basic stuff. It's really obvious. But yet, totally ignored by evolutionists, and to this day claiming, yes, they've not walked this back at all. There's no walking back amongst evolutionists. They're still claiming, yes, the genetic code is this slam dunk poster child evidence proof of evolution. How could you possibly say that? Because you're so driven by the principle of plenitude that you just can't be the same across the entire biosphere, because God wouldn't do it that way. Therefore, it must have evolved. There's no reason from a scientific perspective to say, yeah, you could, if you had a warm little pond and you had some amino acids from a meteorite and you had some sunshine and some ultraviolet waves, you could have some mutations, and then this DNA, that whole thing, has not worked. And as I said, that one of my bullets there was the complexity of the code. It's way beyond the capacity of random mutations and natural selection, not controversial. So it's not as though, we got a pretty good handle on this. No, there is no scientific reason to think this. The reason why the claim is made is as on the basis of these metaphysical arguments based on the mundaneness and the universality as the pillars. And then you have on top of that, God wouldn't do it that way, so therefore it must have evolved. That's the argument. So it's theology that's just playing a critical role. It's playing an epistemological role. It's not just a sidebar. It is the driver. It is the requirement of this argument.
Yes. So even if they're not using the word God, they will still say it wouldn't be that way unless there was common ancestry, right?
Yeah, there's keywords.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do say creator or independent creation, or
right.
if they arose independently. So there's keywords like that. Other times there's things like curious. Darwin liked the word curious. How curious? What he meant was it doesn't make sense on the theory of independent creation. Other times he just came right out with it and said this doesn't make sense on independent creation. So you'll find a little mix of the terminology, but they do like to hide it and mask it.
Yes. And some of it's not intentional. They may not even realize that they are making a religious argument. And many of them don't realize they're making a religious argument and will not admit it. Because they actually can't see it. Right. So they don't even realize how much they've internalized these religious arguments and are using them. And like I said, they'll even take out the words that sound religious. And so it'll sound very scientific. But if you get down to what's going on, what's part of this, it is actually a religious argument. But what about when they say things like, well, I'm not thinking about God at all. I'm testing this against the idea of, things coming about separately. We know it has to be common ancestry because of the universal code, because a code couldn't evolve separately.
because under separate origin, without saying anything about whether it's creationism or not, just separate
Right.
origin, then you would have to have an independently evolving code, and so that would
Right.
be unlikely to happen. Therefore, it has to have this common ancestor. I mean, the problem is we just find so many that whole idea is so refuted by the 6 reasons that I went through. It is not evolvable. It must not be evolvable under that idea. Well, how did that work for you? How did it evolve in the first place then? So your common descent model did not work, regardless of how much you think another model didn't work.
And so I hope people are getting this, because this is what, Dr. Hunter has spent a lot of time trying to understand, and has realized that these are the arguments that hold weight in evolution. It's the religious arguments that are causing people to think evolution is true. It has nothing to do with the scientific arguments. If we follow the science, evolution has been falsified. So why does it persist? And what he realized is that, hey, it's these arguments that are holding weight. Now, when I first started talking to Dr. Hunter, I wasn't sure he was right about this. I actually thought he was probably wrong, that this religious stuff, yeah, I saw it, but I thought it was a side issue. But I remember one time we were talking, and I said to you, like, ooh, that argument, it's a huge blow. And you said, hold up, keep that, get that feeling that it's a huge blow. That is the power of these arguments. And he said, I want you to feel that feeling, and then let's talk about, why does that argument have power? And then he exposed to me that it was a religious argument. And I was like, whoa, I didn't even realize this. It's crazy. And so I've seen it now. I'm getting it now. And I want other people to see this, so that you can recognize, if you ever feel that feeling like, wow, that's a strong argument for evolution, likely, very likely, it is a religious argument. You have a certain idea about what God would and would not do, or something. There's something going on with
And it
your
plays on that.
What?
It plays on that.
It's something about your ideas related to God that are causing that feeling, not something scientific.
Right.
So
it plays on that. So yeah, you have those feelings. We have this intuition. We think God's thoughts after him, and it plays on that. It's using that against you and tricking you into this, it must have evolved. I really like what you said, Rebecca, about how we need to keep in mind that for most evolutionists don't see this, are not going to understand this. And for them, it is just science. And I know that's true because I've talked to them about it. And so they'll make a religious argument in the very next statement, say, that's just science. And so they're not seeing it. So there is a deception here that we need to be aware of. So you can go through the science, you can go through the history, the philosophy, the logic of these arguments, why they're failing and all that stuff. I can do this all day long till I'm blue, but no, it's really going to help if you kind of understand there is a deception going on, and it's playing on the evolutionists as well as other people as well. Even the skeptics aren't getting this, and it's very deceptive. And so it's bringing people to the ridiculous idea that the world arose by itself.
Yeah, just think about this for a minute. Like, think about what it would actually take for all of these complex systems to arise by nothing but chemical and physical processes, just randomly bringing these things together. Guys, it is insane. Like, it's an insane idea. But how is it that so many smart people have been tricked into this?
I mean, we have to laugh at it. We have to laugh at this a little bit. It is so silly. It's so much of a Hans Christian Andersen novel. It is this, emperor without clothes. It's just it's funny. We have to laugh at ourselves a little bit.
Yeah.
And I like the biblical verses. God, I thank you for hiding these things from the wise and revealing them to the babes and the innocent. You got to love that. And there's a bunch of verses like that in the Old Testament and the New Testament. God will fool the wise
Yeah, and it is interesting.
of
There's
this world.
the like seeking to become wise, they became fools.
Oh, yes.
And that is like exactly what has happened. Just, oh, I, the scientist, I have the knowledge. I am the priest of the knowledge of humanity, and they have become fools.
They will
It's,
arrange teachers for themselves and tickle their ears with ridiculous doctrines.
yeah, and I really don't mean to disrespect because there's a lot of people who have been very, I think, innocently deceived by this. Some people have gone into it head first, just and became a fool like all on their own, right? But so many people have just been deceived by
Yeah.
the deep indoctrination in our education system. And you can be very, very smart and get very, very indoctrinated. And especially if you have a compliant personality that doesn't tend to challenge authority, and you have all these authority figures in your life that are, you know, telling you, this is true, evolution is true. It's very hard to get out of that.
Yeah. Very well said, Rebecca.
So, should we take some comments?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Um, Mehrashad says, "Hi, my first question. You correctly mentioned meaningful information is an enormously improbable entity, therefore, randomly searching for it is extremely impossible. But what if mutations are not random?"
Yeah, and I think actually they aren't. And there are directed mutations. And certainly there are directed adaptation mechanisms for individuals to respond to environmental threats rapidly within a lifetime. So there is a lot of non-random directed action in biology, but that's not, you're not going to create new worlds with that. That's for adjusting and adapting to the evolving environment around you. As a comet hits and the temperatures change, a new predator enters your biosphere, ecosphere, whatever, things like that. You're going to a climate, you have a drought, and the food supply changes. You need to change with it. So that's what you get with that. You don't get something from nothing. You don't get 10 million species where there were none. You don't get a DNA code where there was none. So I don't think those sorts of mechanisms are explanatory.
Yes, thank you so much. Anarcho-Republican says, imagine being so dedicated to your postmodern creation myth that you actually characterize DNA as mundane. That defies wonder and insults biology.
Yeah, exactly. This is what it frees you up. Once you start to see this and you start to step back, and you'll see the emperor's new clothing sorts of mythology that you've been fooled by, and you start to realize exactly this sort of comment here is like, wow, this was so insulting and so ridiculous.
Yes, I mean the DNA is so incredible. Like or I should say the DNA code is so incredible. There's nothing that we have created like it. If you
Yeah.
think about all the complex computer codes that have been created that have taken enormous intelligent effort to create. And then you have DNA code that is compressed. It can like, some of it is just like, it can read backward and forward, and there's so many complexities in DNA code that go way beyond anything we've ever created. And so it's really amazing. And like we're saying that came about by random chance when, I mean, by random mutations and natural processes when we can't even create anything like that. We haven't thus far.
Anyone sitting through a life science degree will see this over and over again every day, every lecture. You're going through these things, and the lens that you're seeing them through is so silly and ridiculous, and it's always presented as, yeah, it just came about, it just randomly evolved, and you're looking at these wonders that, as you said, Rebecca, we could never create ourselves. They're incredible. It's a blessing, as Adam Sedgwick said to Darwin. It's a real blessing to be able to be a scientist who can look at these things and learn about these things. There's a burden. There's a burden that comes with that you need to teach and convey these things honestly and genuinely, what they really are, and not lie about them. And I agree with you. So we've said that evolutionists, 90% of evolutionists don't understand the religion that they're promoting and the deception that this is. But I also say that you are without excuse because it's so obvious.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, we know evolution is true because of the preponderance of the evidence, the tons of evidence, the mountain of evidence, the voluminous evidence, and all the other adjectives that prove evolution. I love this comment. Thank you so
That's great.
much.
Copy and paste that one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, it's true. Well, so in public debate, there's a lot of tricks that are used. And one of them is tone of voice and these words that are used. And so you just simply frame the conclusion by your own presentation. It's monumental. It's voluminous. It's mountain of evidence. It's tons of evidence. So you just say these things without any backup. And if that's just repeated over and over and over again, as many times as it is, people start to believe it, and you'll start to believe it. You just keep on saying it. So,
Yes, totally. And so anyone who still believes that there is a mountain of evidence for evolution, well, let's start taking that mountain down rock by rock. And that's what I'm trying to do on this channel, because actually I haven't seen this mountain of evidence. Dr. Hunter has read, I don't know how many books on evolution and studied this throughout your time, and you haven't found that mountain of evidence. I haven't found the mountain of evidence. I've read a lot of
where's the
books.
beef?
Yeah,
Where's the beef?
exactly.
And
Where's
so
the
when
beef?
you debate an evolutionist on topic A, and you demolish their point, they won't change their mind. I've never seen that. Oh, good point. Let me think about that. Maybe you're right. Maybe evolution is true. It's always, well, but there's all that other evidence. It's always referred. So I like the comment from that perspective. There's always, well, there's all that other evidence. Well, wait a minute. Well, what other evidence? Because I just demolished your first one. So what other ones are you talking about? There never is, like, you just have to read deeper in Darwin's book. If you just haven't read far enough, you got to get down to page 337, and that's where you're going to get that, the one that you haven't seen yet. No, it doesn't work that way. There is no beef here. There's no mountain of evidence that we just haven't looked at yet.
Yeah. So please bring this evidence. And I regularly allow people to jump on my streams and share their evidence for evolution. And you'll find it's very rare that anyone can even offer a very weak piece of evidence. Occasionally, they can offer a very weak piece of evidence. But think about the claim that's being made, that all of this came about by random mutation and natural selection. Huge claim. And I think we'd need a little more evidence, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Vestuven, it's blatantly obvious that the genomes of animals were written by a genius. Totally agree. Thank you so much. Okay. Bill Johnson says the best evidence for evolution is the observation that life forms change dramatically over the last few billion years.
That may be the best evidence. It's possible. I don't think evolutionists would say that because I think there is, according to evolutionists, better evidence. But certainly that is touted as a strong evidence by evolutionists. Life forms changed dramatically over the last few billion years. The fossil record shows us that in the past there were different forms, different organisms, different species in the past than there are now. What it doesn't show us is how they got there. And the claim is, so why should we believe that that's proof of evolution? So your statement here, the best evidence for evolution is the observation that life forms change. That entails what we talked about in our previous video, this religious assumption that God, if God created the world, it would be static. You have to have a static world with creationism. If you detect change, then ipso facto, evolution is true. Evolution must be true because we saw change. And if God created the world, it must be static. So again, it's always back to contrastive thinking. It's always the other guy's wrong. There's no explanation. We have no idea how the most fantastic eyes ever appeared abruptly in the fossil record 500 million years ago. Somehow that happened. Species appear as though they're planted there. There's no way that random mutations and natural selection could have created these wonders, but it must be true because there was change. So this, if that is the best evidence, then this is a good illustration of how weak evolutionary theory is. Again, as I said, I think there are better arguments and evidences, but even those are absolute failures when you actually open up the hood and look at them. And they are plenitude or utilitarian arguments. Their power comes from the theology that's implicit in the argument.
Right. And we need to talk about what kind of changes are happening, because if you're just going to point at finch beaks and say this one got bigger, this population's beaks got bigger. Okay. But then a couple years later, they got smaller again when the environment changed. So these are all variations that are possible already within the organisms. And then, when we look at, okay, let's look at what we have for fossils, right? Fossil record. Well, we certainly have a lot of animals that are no longer alive. But where do we get the idea that they changed? I was at the museum, natural museum. I don't know if it was a natural history museum. It was a museum in Houston. And you know what they had? They had on display a fossil of a horseshoe crab, and it was beautiful because you could see its tracks through the sand, and then the horseshoe crab. And that was something like, I might be getting the date slightly wrong, I think it was like 450 to 500 million year old fossil according to them. Okay, so think about that, 450 to 500 million year old horseshoe crab. And you know what, that fossil looks exactly like the horseshoe crab that they have in their tank that I was able to go and touch. I touched a horseshoe crab that is still alive today that looks exactly the same as the fossil that I saw in the other room from supposedly 500 million years ago. So what is it about the form of the horseshoe crab that just so perfect that it wouldn't change for 500 million years? Guys, think about this. Like, this is the story. It's storytelling. You're putting things in order and trying to tell a story about how they happened. But there's so many things in the story that just don't make sense. Okay. It does not make sense scientifically.
And it appeared abruptly in the fossil record in the first place.
Right. So where's all the years of development of that horseshoe crab? How did those complex features get developed? Why does it suddenly appear? So yeah, there's so many holes in this story, and it's hard to follow every trail, but just take it down piece by piece, because you'll see that you have believed, you have been deceived. All right. Everything else supports that this happened: DNA, geology, physics, and archaeology.
So when you say this happened, I assume he means evolution.
Yes.
Everything else. So there's that mountain of evidence. There's that other evidence over there. So you get, okay, you guys are picking away at some little problem here, but everything else, I don't know how physics. Let's just say he lists as DNA, geology, physics, and archaeology. Well, so DNA does not support that. I don't know how he gets DNA supporting it. Physics, physics does not support it. Physics refutes it. So statistical mechanics is a branch of physics, and evolution defies statistical mechanics. Evolution is constantly coming up with these entropically and getting over these entropic barriers and coming up with these unlikely designs. It just happened. We had a whole bunch of random mutations got together and did this. You can't just have 2 or 3 mutations to create vision, or to create a bacteria, or a gazillion other designs, a ribosome, a mitochondria. You have to have a large number of mutations fortuitously coming together. It's not going to happen in this universe, in this time frame. So physics doesn't help you. Physics is your enemy.
Yes. And in fact, I've seen a quote. I'll pull out the book right here, and I'll just tell you that in this book, you'll find a quote that says, well, this is about the origin of life, trying to get life, trying to get life to arise by physical and chemical processes. And you know what it says? It's like, we are actually thinking that we need a new physics in order to get this. We need new laws of chemistry and physics. Maybe there were different laws operating, because that's the only way we can see how we could possibly get life to arise.
I've heard those sorts of statements. Yeah.
Yeah.
It ain't working.
Yes. And archaeology, I'm not sure what is going on with what you mean by that, but that, I would say, is also not in your favor. There's lots of problems with that. Let's talk about, why is all of our writing only available, like we just have like writing from like 5,000 years ago? Like, why did we all of a sudden start writing? Why, this is when we track population growth, where are all the people? If you watch just in the past couple thousand years, how much population growth has just exploded, right? Well, if you go back in time, you don't get very far back before the population is 0. Okay. And if you look up what evolution says about the population growth rate over all of these, hundreds of thousands of years that they're proposing, that, humans have been evolving from an ape-like common ancestor, back to the millions of years, right? Their population growth rate will be like 0.0000. Like, it's so small, and that's also not a very scientific way of understanding population growth, right? Like, populations can't survive without reproducing.
Cavemen's huddled around a little fire, and throwing rocks around and barely surviving and getting killed off.
Right. So I think there's a lot of problems for the evolution story with all of these areas that you're mentioning. So thank you. Now, Kevin says there's something oddly entertaining about watching science denialism.
Yep. So it's funny how those who are wedded to metaphysics are the ones who don't, wedded most to metaphysics are the ones who least understand it. So they're oblivious to the fact that they're wedded to metaphysics. So when I went through the 6 problems here, one of the things I said was, these are not controversial. They're science, and we should all be able to speak this language together. We should all agree. These are things we should agree on, no matter what your position is. So I'm not big on whether creationism is true or false, or evolution is true or false from a religious perspective, I'm looking at it from a scientific perspective. So when you say it's science denialism, so I think you need to look in the mirror there.
And I would just ask Kevin, what have we said that is denying science? Like, because, I've heard Dr. Hunter give the science. So what have we said that's a denial, right, of science? And I like this response. One man's science denialism is another man's Galileo.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, these are just terms that are thrown out. It's, again, in public debate, there's a lot of tricks. And one, as I mentioned earlier, one trick is the tone of voice and just simply making claim, name it, claim it. Those are just mountains of evidence. Another one is, it's so entertaining to watch science denialism. So it's a vacuous claim. It's an empty claim. What he should have come forth with is, on your third one, you made this mistake. You don't understand science because you made this mistake. Okay, that would be a fair comment, but he doesn't make that comment.
Right. Tom says the creation is evidence for God.
Yeah, that's true. When you
Totally
see,
agree, Tom.
yeah, simple as that.
Thank you. And Bill says the problem with the earth being created is that there is no evidence of a creator.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite take there is the early one. Yeah. If evolution fails, then you have a problem.
Yes. And I think there is plenty of evidence for the creator on earth. And so that's actually what we're trying to show people.
You're not, if you need to reckon with the science. And if you're believing that evolution is true or well supported or whatever you want to say, fact, then you're not reckoning with the science. And so when you say things like there's no evidence of a creator, you need to demonstrate that you're reckoning with the science.
Yes. Reezy, thanks for your support. Says smash the like button. Thank you. Mr. Green says he smashed it. Thank you, Mr. Green. And let's see. Tassin Sabit says, when they say random mutation, it means mutations can happen in any part of DNA. But which one survives and which one doesn't is decided usually by natural selection.
Does that help? No, it doesn't help. That doesn't change things. So natural selection is a word, a term, a label that's used to describe the fact that most mutations are not good, not helpful, or neutral at best. Bad mutations, harmful mutations will be killed off. So bad designs that don't yield children, they're going to be killed off. So that's natural selection. You still need random mutations. So one thing that natural selection cannot do, and I'm saying this because this is violated in the literature all the time, natural selections cannot guide or induce the right mutations to happen. Natural selection doesn't do that. So there's no influence backwards to the mutation. The mutations have to happen by themselves. The random mutations cannot be induced. So you have if you look at all the mutations that were used that created humans, let's say, every one of those had to be random. They cannot be induced by natural selection. So you've got a huge problem on your hand. It doesn't work. Random mutations and natural selection doesn't work. And so you can't fall back on this sort of, fake argument that, but natural selection does it. No, natural selection doesn't do it. All of the mutations have to be random.
Yes. Tossin says, can you guys bring an evolutionary biologist here and then debate with him, please? I am happy to have an evolutionary biologist on my channel. I've had several evolutionary biologists, with PhDs come on my channel and talk to me, and I'd be happy to have more. In fact, I recently emailed several evolutionary biologists and asked them if they would come on and talk with me. And they said no. So if you have an evolutionary biologist that wants to come on and talk to me, I would love that. I absolutely love talking to evolutionary biologists. So please send any ones that you know that are willing to come on and talk with me. I'd be happy. Love that. Ryan says Austin Sims has educated you on several times on various platforms, so that's some BS. I don't know what you're saying is BS. Okay, but yeah, I've talked to Austin Sims. He's a cool guy, and I would talk to him again. But has he given me good evidence for evolution? Absolutely not. I'm not sure what you mean by he's educated me. So I've listened to him talk, and I so, and I'd talk to him again, as I said. Okay, Pigs Can Fly says science allows for questions to be asked and for falsification of its predominantly held theories. That's the whole point. Most people these days fail to recognize this point.
Yeah, and it shows how deeply held the theory is and how metaphysics are at play, non-scientific factors are at play when you bring scientific problems to the fore of a theory and people are in denial of that and well, don't recognize that. There needs to be a recognition. People need to reckon with the science.
Yes. The Jelly Man says, hey, realist. Hello.
Thank you.
Anarcho Republic says evolution for all practical purposes unfalsifiable. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. I mean, you do have changes. You do have paradigm shifts and changes in the history of science, and things that were tightly held go away later. So who can predict the future? But for sure, for now, like people say, why don't you debate evolutionists? Could you debate evolutionists? Well, I do debate evolutionists. I've debated evolutionists extensively, both on television, on radio, in person, on college campuses, and of course, a lot on the internet. And it always goes the same way. I mean, I can beat them all day long, but they'll never change their mind because it's unfalsifiable, because it's not about the science. So in that sense, it becomes unfalsifiable. There's always another explanation. Oh, but then some random mutations happened. Then this happened. You can always call it. It's an umbrella theory with dozens of explanatory mechanisms that can be called upon, and things that were in years prior would never have been used as an explanation because they're so unlikely, are now used because they're more desperate. Things that would have falsified that you would have thought would have falsified things that I know that personally evolutionists have told me this would falsify evolution if we discovered this. Well, now we have discovered it, and they're still evolutionists. So I think certainly, in my lifetime and kind of for the time since Darwin or going back to the Epicureans, it seems unfalsifiable. Maybe there'll be a time where people will see the deception and understand it for what it is, and maybe it will become falsified in the eyes of people. But it sure seems unfalsifiable because it's a theological, metaphysical theory, not vulnerable to scientific evidence.
Yes. And Rick asks, how is it bad science? This is referring to my comment about the evidence presented on the series with Gutsick Gibbon. And TP Seeker is also asking, what about the evidence that Gutsick Gibbon presents? Okay. So maybe I shouldn't have said bad science. I should say most of it is not scientific evidence for evolution. It is religious evidence for evolution. I'll give you an example, okay? When we're looking at whale evolution, right? We're shown these bones, right? Similar bones in a land mammal and similar bones in a whale, the involucrum, some part of the limb bone. And these few bones are being used to support the idea. Think about this, guys, that a land mammal slowly turned into a whale. Do you know how many major morphological changes have to happen for that to occur. It and the evidence that we're being presented is similarity of bones. But where do we get the idea that similarity of bones means that one thing became another? We get that from a religious idea. God wouldn't put similar bones in these different creatures. Okay. So, and that can come from a couple of different ideas, right, Dr. Hunter? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I do, but I just wanted to point out also that the reason it's bad science is because it's unlikely. So the evolution of the species is unlikely. It's low probability. In fact, some evolutionists have come forth and said this is evidence for the multiverse because we need more time. It couldn't have happened in the 13 billion years of this universe, so we need more time because it's so unlikely. So, science seeks to explain the natural world and how things work, not come up with theories that are unlikely and then make apologies for them and come up with heroic explanations of how maybe it could have happened somehow. As Rebecca says, this is all driven by theology. And this is where it gets tricky and deceptive. And you really have to kind of follow the shell game going on. But it's not driven by, oh, we have scientific evidence, we have experiments, we go out in the field and look, we've got all this evidence. And yeah, it seems really reasonable and logical and likely that evolution happened. No, that none of that ever happened. That's a mythology. It's unlikely. What science has found is a series of major problems with the theory of evolution. Now, after Darwin, they came up with kind of a version 2.0 in the mid 20th century called the modern synthesis. And that was sold and taught in schools as a fact. Of course, before the modern synthesis, many evolutionists called Darwin's theory a fact as well. But it got even stronger with the modern synthesis that kind of filled in the blanks, that finished it off. And we now knew that the history, the true history of the origin of life on Earth, all we're doing now is, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. We know, the modern synthesis is true. Well, now we know that's false. So even evolutionists have been forced to walk that back and say, yeah, we need a version 3.0 here because that's not working. But we don't have a version 3.0 because it's too hard to come up with. So there's a plethora of theories or hypotheses out there because none of them work. This is not working according to evolution. We've talked just in this podcast about the DNA code and how the evolution of the DNA code doesn't fit evolution. Evolution is the wrong tool. It doesn't fit the observables, what we understand about I'm sorry, I said the DNA code, I meant the genetic code. I like that term better. The genetic code doesn't fit evolution. So that's bad science. You say, how is it bad science? It's bad science in many, many, many ways. It's also bad science from a higher view that it's claimed to be a fact. So this is the consensus view amongst evolutionists, overwhelming consensus view that it's a fact or true or no question about it, however you want to put it. And so that doesn't follow from the scientific evidence. So it's a claim that's clearly false from the science. But there's very powerful theological arguments for it. And that's where the fact claim comes. So I've always said this, that it's a theological theory that drives science to a bad place. It creates bad science. It forces science to engage in ridiculous storytelling. And so when you say, how is it bad science? Yeah, it's bad science because it's being driven theologically. They need it to be true for religious reasons. And so you end up with making things up in the science. It's not just a let's follow the evidence sort of thing, which is what we like to think of science as doing. So that's how it's bad science.
Yeah, and there's a lot of comments coming up about the whales. And so I just want to say I have an entire video talking about this. So it's on my homepage. You should see it. You'll see a big whale. And so I don't want to go into talking about all the problems, major problems, and this absurd story of whale evolution. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now, but I'll just flash through these comments really quickly and then say, please go watch my video on that, because this idea of a mammal, a land mammal turning into a whale over millions of years is one of the most absurd stories that has ever been given to the public. And yet now it's being talked about as if it's the best evidence for evolution. It's this is just absolutely insane. So, but some of the arguments that are made, are in here. So whales have one of the biggest collections of fossils. Yeah, and what you're going to see is you're going to find animals that live in the water, and then you're going to have land mammals that are being called whales, right? I mean, it's just so all abundance of fossils that are just different creatures that lived in the water is not evidence that these developed from a land mammal over time.
Again, we have the species. We don't know how they got there. The fossil records doesn't tell us how they got there. If you look at all the purported species that are supposed to be whale-like or pre-whale, leading to that, they don't form a lineage. They form a tree, a bush. However, even evolutionists have had to walk that back. Anyway, back to you, Rebecca.
Right. And Rick says, is a whale a fish or a mammal? Well, it's a mammal. But what is the problem with that? Like that doesn't say that it came from the land. See, that's even evolutionary thinking right there. So, and this is, what I've heard evolutionists say, well, how can you explain a mammal that lives in the water like that? Well, it's a mammal that lives in the water.
Mammals don't live in the water; they are on the ground. Yeah, it is very perceptive of you, Rebecca, to point this out, that this is evolutionary thinking is embedded in these claims. So it's like when Darwin said there's no greater anomaly than a bird than a bird that cannot fly. No greater anomaly than a bird that cannot fly. Well, why is that an anomaly? Because birds fly. And so the ones that don't fly must have evolved to a bad state, rudimentary, they lost some capability or something. So again, you're bringing evolutionary thinking to your arguments. Why can't a mammal be in the water?
Right. And so now, if you're thinking in evolutionary terms, then you're thinking, okay, I've got to make an evolutionary tree. So now you have to explain how a mammal got into the water, right? So that's your problem. That's an evolution problem. That's not my problem. My story is God created, and God can put a mammal wherever he wants to put a mammal, right? And so for my story, I don't need an explanation for why a mammal is in the water.
You're looking at tens of thousands of mutations that would have to have happened to to evolve a whale. The capabilities of a whale in the water are fantastic. And it has all kinds of incredible capabilities and structures within it. And it just, how would you evolve those? Of course, there's no explanation. There's no detailed step-by-step explanation by evolutionists. But just as a rough order of magnitude, you would need tens of thousands of mutations to happen. The capability of evolution is like half a dozen at best. It could create a few mutations. I'm talking about mutations that actually do good things, and toward making a whale. You can have a lot more mutations, but they're not doing anything.
They're not just mutations; they have to be coordinated.
Well, that's what
a single mutation is not going to make a new feature. You have to have these mutations that work together to make one of the many amazing features in whales that are not in land mammals.
But you're making a very good point that they have to be coordinated. They have to work together and do things. So there is, I don't have the title of the paper, but there is a paper not too long ago. I can't give any details right now, but that actually is engaging in this idea of one or two genes arising that somehow do create all these changes. So there is this huge coordination coming out of just somehow it's like a hopeful monster kind of an idea. You get all this for free if you just get a few mutations and you have a few genes kind of changing the way they work. All of a sudden you get all these changes to create the whale. So it's just this magical thinking that points out exactly your point there, Rebecca.
Yeah, and wow, people are really going crazy on the whale stuff. And I don't know how much more I want to do on that because there's some other good comments. So let's take a break from the whales. And maybe I'll come back to those unless you want to keep going with the whales.
No, I have no. I mean, it's just I've said what I want to say about the whales.
Okay, so again, if you want to talk more about whales, hey, I invite anybody. If you really think you have good evidence for whale evolution, let's talk about it on my channel or go watch my video first, please, because you should see the problems. So Rick says, okay, what is being said here is very weak and seems like more gaslighting. I don't know what we've said that's gaslighting, but I mean, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you, Rick, a longer conversation, because I know it's hard to express things in the chat. Work academics or work academics says, I am saying that even if you credit God with creating life, evolution could still occur as a natural process. They are not mutually exclusive.
The problem is you have to have some reason for wanting to believe that evolution occurred after your origin of life deal. So if you have God creating origin of life and then evolution occurs, why would you say that? Well, what is the point? You know, of course I agree with you that of course, you know, you could have God doing one part and secondary causes doing another part, of course. And I'm totally, from a theological perspective, I'm like, okay, that's fine. But although there are some issues with that, but that's, you know, it's a longer discussion. But in principle, I'll go along with at least a discussion on that. But my first point to you is why? Why would you want to go there? What is the purpose of positing that, yeah, God does the hard part there at the beginning and then evolution takes over and does the rest? Why? What is the point? Because the answer to that question is it's always something that I don't want God to be doing. It's not because the science reveals it. This is not a scientifically motivated suggestion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so if evolution doesn't stand up under our scientific observations, then why should we consider it as what God might have done, right? Although I will say what evolution needs is miracles, right? It needs a lot of miracles. And if you have a miracle maker and you're fine with your miracle maker doing miracles to make evolution happen, I can't argue with you. Go ahead, believe evolution. I mean, I believe in a miracle maker and I believe he makes miracles today. So if somebody invokes God as their miracle maker to make evolution happen, then okay, great. I'm fine with that.
B.B. Warfield.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what he.
Okay, I'm going to go back to some earlier comments. Callum says DNA RNA code points to intelligent design. Thank you. Now, this is about my comment about the horseshoe crab that I said it's lasted all of these, hundreds of millions of years without being changed. And Welsh says perhaps the horseshoe crab has reached a point where its evolution suits the environment it lives in. Personal incredulity isn't evidence of denial. Bye. Okay. Well, you know what? That is the evolutionary story, right? If something gets so perfect that it's just perfectly suited for its environment, then it doesn't really need to evolve anymore. And that's the story that they'll tell you about the horseshoe crab. But the story, you see what I'm saying, how this is a problem, because what you should start to identify is that everything fits the evolution story. If it
Right.
changes, it's evolution. If it doesn't change, it's evolution. It's amazing how evolution takes care of everything under any circumstance, right?
Yeah.
So that is not a scientific and falsifiable theory if it can accommodate any scenario.
Yeah. And by the way, there's a lot of other examples in addition to the horseshoe crab. There's many examples of what they call stasis, things that just don't change. And that's why Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge came up with this punctuated equilibrium idea of, okay, evolution happens really fast at certain points in history, and then nothing happens for a while. And because that way the fossils won't show anything, and that's why we don't see anything in the fossil record. So it's a tautology. And I agree with the point here that stasis, evidence of stasis in the fossil record doesn't necessarily kill evolution, isn't necessarily demolish the theory of evolution. But as Rebecca says here, it's another point that it's just whatever we find, it evolved.
Reezy says finch beaks are due to cyclic change. Thank you. That is what has been observed.
They're also rapid adaptations to environmental challenges, not random mutation and natural selection.
Thank you. Ryan says, you said you would have an evolutionary biologist on. You have, and you've been educated. That's what's BS. Okay, thank you for explaining what's BS, Ryan. You're right. I have had evolutionary biologists on. Do you think they've made good scientific arguments for evolution? If so, tell me what they were, because I haven't heard them. Jeffrey says DNA is a language or code, and all codes require intelligence. Therefore, we are seeing common design, not common descent.
Which gets back to the idea that it's very difficult to see how evolution could have created a code. It's just that is a tall order for random mutations and natural selection, which is why evolutionists have struggled to come up with an explanation for how it evolved. To be honest, we're stuck.
Thank you. Okay, Kevin says even most Christians have to acknowledge that the universe appears to run on autopilot most of the time. Surely God doesn't push atoms around by hand. Evolution just follows that observation.
Yeah. So first of all, there's so much to unpack here. The idea that the universe appears to run on autopilot, that is not what I see in the science. That's not what most people see in the science. You can say that's true for certain times and certain places, certain events. So yeah, sometimes it appears to run on autopilot. Other times it does not appear to run on autopilot. If you have a situation where it doesn't run on autopilot at certain points, then that should tell you something. God, traditionally, Orthodox biblical understanding is that God works both through primary causation and secondary causation. So God uses the natural relationships or natural laws that He has instantiated, and that's what happens. In Psalm 148 says that the planets run in their cycles and so forth. But there's also miracles. There's also where God intervenes and does things. So, and that's what we observe. Like, we don't observe things running on autopilot.
Well, what do you mean when you say things don't run on, when we don't observe things running on autopilot? Because I want to make sure that what you mean by that is what the commenter means.
Is what Kevin is getting at. Yeah. There's, of course, that's another thing to unpack, right? There's a whole bunch of things that do not appear to run on autopilot. But one that I think we can kind of focus on here, because that's what the point of the podcast is evolution. So evolution does not appear, the origin of life on Earth does not appear to be something that was caused by natural laws running on autopilot. So if that appears to run on autopilot to you, then you have a scientific problem. There's a problem with your understanding or your knowledge of the science. It doesn't appear to run on autopilot at all.
Right. That's a good point. I was thinking more in terms like I was going to totally agree with the commenter in that, we have these, we have laws, physics that seem to work all of the time
Right.
without, an intervention needing to happen.
Yeah.
So, but you made a great point about that, and this is kind of a good response to what you're saying, Kevin, is that you know, there are things that God has set in motion that, yeah, they continue in motion and they continue going on, but it doesn't look like life and evolution is one of those things, right?
Here's
Like,
another, here's another one for Kevin and for others who are interested in this point. Is it running on autopilot? Is the world running on autopilot? Let's bring it down to today now. So as you're watching me, as you're looking at the screen, you're seeing, you're like you're living in this movie, right? I call it conscious sensory perception. Conscious sensory perception, like we're in this movie. Every minute, every waking minute of our lives, your brain is fusing together the visual, the auditory, the taste, touch, feel, all the things are coming together, and you're in this movie. So there's no autopilot. Nothing there is explained by natural law. We don't understand how this happens. So you do have these electrical signals coming into your brain. So all of your senses convert the phenomena that they are sensing, sound, light, etc. They're converting that to electrical signals. And so you're getting these electrical signals coming into your brain. And then that affects the brain, and you've got neurons in the brain that are have electrical signals floating around. We can watch that. We can see that. There's electrochemical gradients that are happening. There's our ions crossing membranes, all this activity going on. We don't see a thought. We don't see a perception. We don't see any of that. There's no evidence for that. There's no scientific evidence for how it is. How are you seeing this screen right now? How are you hearing this? How is your mind putting all that together and thinking things out? How do you have consciousness? None of that is explained by science, natural laws. So right there, every human that has ever lived, for every waking moment, has an abundance of evidence for how it's not running on autopilot. Something is going on. I have this consciousness, which is not explained by physics, biology, all the different sciences.
yeah, thank you so much. There's so many good comments here. I don't know what time you want to stop, but I'm just loving these comments. I have so many more I want to put up. Are you fine?
Well, I'm fine for a little bit more here.
Okay, good. All right. So, now this has a little bit of cussing in it. I'm not going to read the bad words, but I will, but it's a good comment still. So, Prodent 2002 says, because we got empirical evidence of evolution coming out our bleep, how could we ignore it? The Bible doesn't say God ain't talking. What the bleep? Okay, so
Bible doesn't say.
What is the empirical evidence of evolution that you've got just everywhere? I mean, where is this? Because this is the common claim, and this is what people are being taught. This is what they're being told. But when you look at the evidence, when you try to find it, it's not there, guys.
But I like the comment because he's making a claim. So we can have a rational, we don't have to shout, we don't have to, talk over each other or anything like that. We have a claim being made, and we can ask for a follow-up. So what is, you asked the question exactly right, Rebecca, I think. What is the empirical evidence that's overwhelming, out our yin yang? How can we not ignore evolution? If you can answer that question, I will be the first one to say, oh, good point. I'm an evolutionist from here on out. I've changed my opinion right now. My opinion right now is that we do not have empirical evidence for evolution. In fact, the empirical evidence is overwhelming against evolution. And it's, in fact, it's a silly idea. It's a ridiculous idea. People who think evolution is true because of the science don't have an excuse. You don't have an excuse because this isn't close. We're not like, oh, you just missed, you made a math error or something. It is so ridiculous. It's like saying you've got all this empirical evidence that of the emperor's new clothes. No, you don't. You don't have that evidence. It's a false claim. All those guys who were wondering how beautifully emperor's new clothes were, they didn't have the evidence. There was something else going on. And that's what's going on here. There's something else going on. For you to say that there's all this empirical evidence for evolution. On the other hand, I'm welcome to be disabused if I'm wrong. So I'd love to hear, what is this empirical evidence? I mean, I have been studying this for decades. I do read the evolution literature. I am a collector of arguments and evidences. That's what I do. I've collected all the evidences I could find, every argument I could find for evolution made by the top evolutionists in the world, the guys who actually, do this for a living, the Jerry Cohn and, back to Darwin, all the books, the articles, the magazine articles, that's what I hunt down and I collect. So it's not like I'm expecting you to come up with something.
And he follows on with, it's got to be true, evolution. You guys are evolving into bleep holes before my eyes.
Okay, that's the level that we're at here. That shows the level that we're at.
Well, no, I love this. Like, thank you for just having a human emotion. I love it. This is the kind of comment I absolutely love. So, I don't know if you're enjoying that, Cornelius, but I am.
Oh, I do too. I do too.
You do? Okay.
I agree.
Yeah, and also I do want to go back and just say about your other comment, because you said God isn't talking. Please pick up a Bible and see what God says to you when you read it. And please get to the part about Jesus dying on the cross for your sins and promising you eternal life. In fact, you could just even start there in the book of John. That's what I recommend. Start there and read what Jesus says about himself and the promises he makes to you and the love that he has for you. And, that's what the Bible says. God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I think we're all feeling the corruption of the world in various ways. We look around at the world, we watch the news, we feel the effects of the corruption of this world. And the corruption it's everywhere. And it's not just those people over there. Okay. Look, there's a lot of people trying to do good in the world. And so you might be one of those people. But that corruption that's out there is also in you. And I think if people pay attention to that, this is the problem with humanity, and God has a solution. The solution is God coming in the flesh and dying on the cross for the sins of the world. That's our promise of healing. That's our promise of restoration. That's our promise that the corruption of this world is going to pass away, and God is making a new place for us, and we will see the end of human corruption, right? We have the promise from Jesus of eternal life in his kingdom and full restoration, forgiveness of sins, and the eradication of sin. There will come a time when you no longer have to deal with the corruption of the outside world and the corruption within, right? And so that's the promise of God.
That's a great point, Rebecca. And yeah, when it says God is not talking, I think that's exactly right, that you need to read the Bible. God is talking a lot, and a lot of it is through the Bible, but there's also a lot of other talk. But if you're struggling and you don't feel like God is talking to you, I can say confidently to everyone, I can tell you how to hear God today. You can hear God today, and that's by picking up a Bible and reading it. And there are so many Bibles available. You can go online and read it. There are people, And there are places in the world where that's not so, and people are dying for just one verse. Just give me a scrap, give me one page. I just want to read a little bit of the Bible. And here we are, drowning in Bibles. All you have to do is read the Bible. And I agree with Rebecca. The New Testament's a good place to start, maybe the Book of John. But you look at that, and you'll come up with something. It varies. You may learn a little bit, and that's interesting. Other times it really hits you heavy. You'll come up with something, and God will talk to you that way. So God is talking. There's no question about that in my mind. By the way, also, I think you can be an evolutionist and get the atonement, the saving grace from Jesus.
Yeah, you totally. Look, we're not telling you have to give up your evolution. Okay, you can, if you want to keep your evolution, you can still believe in Jesus and be just as saved. Okay, so please don't let that be a problem. We're just trying to show you the truth that actually evolution is false. But okay, same commenter says, we had solid evidence before DNA. When DNA technology came along, we had solid empirical scientific proof for the theory.
Right, for sure. I mean, the arguments and evidences for evolution predate, the explosion of molecular biology in the mid-20th century. Of course, I mean, that's what Darwin's book was all about. The evidence goes back centuries. It goes all the way back to the Epicureans. So yeah, there's always been evidence and arguments for a naturalistic origin of the world. The problem is it fails on the science. It fails dramatically. And that's what this and the previous videos have all talked about. I don't know how you could watch this podcast and say, well, it's solid evidence. Of course, it's not solid. It fails dramatically. So yes, there are the scientific claims, but when you look at under the hood at the science, it's terrible. It's evidence against evolution. So it's really no question. This isn't like a debate. Again, we should all be able to agree. I should say, it's not controversial. It should not be controversial. We should all be able to agree on the science. We can argue about the other things, but let's all agree on the science. Nothing that I said in this video is scientifically controversial. It's all straightforward empirical science and inferences entailed therein.
Yes. And I'm kind of jumping around on the comments. So just because I'm going to a more recent comment doesn't mean I won't eventually get to yours. But I have to put this up because this, Black Hat, prepare yourself. I want to show you that this is a religious argument. Okay, you're saying, Cornelius, a single question. Us being more similar to chimps than mice are to rats, yet we aren't related to chimps, but mice are related to rats. I never mentioned God, so don't bring him up. Okay, if you don't get this, I want to respond to this while you're thinking about it. And
yeah, go for it.
Because I know what he's referring to, because this is a common argument, right? That because humans are more similar to chimps than mice, than mice are to rats. So there's a bigger difference between mice and rats, and yet some people will say, some creationists will have no problem with mice and rats having a common ancestor, even though they are genetically more different than humans and chimps.
Yeah, I get it.
We have a problem with chimps and humans having a common ancestor. But I want to ask you, I want to say, first of all, okay, where did you get the idea about how much similarity means something has a common ancestor, right? What if we were, let's say, what if we only had 10 base pairs difference from chimps? Okay, would that mean that we had a common ancestor?
Well, of course.
If so, how did you get there? Right? Okay. Did you want to say something?
No, I was playing the evolutionist, but I get I have heard this argument too. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think your response is correct. First of all, you need to start unpacking. and start with, okay, where do we get the idea that similarity implies common ancestry? We got to find that out first, and that will probably reveal that we're no longer in empirical science land.
Right. So Black Cat, and I mean, I wish we could just talk to Black Cat directly. I will check the chat and see if Black Cat is responding. But so
I didn't know that mice are related to rats. I don't really. I assume when he says related to rats, I assume he means there's a common ancestor and they evolved.
Right. That's what.
So I didn't know that.
Okay. So Black Cat says it's how we tell who's related, who we are related to.
So what he means is, I think he means, what's it called? When you trace your family history and you, in a court of law, you can determine, is this guy the uncle of that guy, or, within a human population, you can use genetic testing to determine relationships, right? That's a totally different thing than the evolution of different species.
Right. And so this is where I want to expose your religious thinking, because you obviously have an idea about how things should look if evolution isn't true. Okay. So you didn't bring up God, but are you thinking about God? Because if not, what's the hypothesis that you're comparing to, right? You're saying we see these similarities and therefore evolution is true. What else have you considered? Have you considered any other options? Because I'm guessing that you are considering an option, right? And there's something going on in your mind that's saying God wouldn't do it that way. God wouldn't make humans and chimps so similar if they didn't come from a common ancestor, right? Like God wouldn't do it that way. And so that's what I'm guessing. I could be wrong about that. So please put it in the chat if there's something else that you're thinking about.
There's a lot to unpack here, though. There's another issue I want to at least alert people to, is that the morphological and behavioral similarities and differences between rats and mice, they're very similar. I'm not talking about genetics or anything like that. Just their structures and their behavior is very similar. Chimps and humans are not. They're very different. So to compare these is not accurate. It's big, huge difference between chimps and humans.
Okay, Black Cat says, if we were more similar to rats than we are to chimps, then we wouldn't be able to say that genetics is reliable.
Well, I think when he says genetics is reliable, it means how well does genetics line up with morphology, with the observable? Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So Black Cat says, so I said don't bring up God, and I didn't bring up God, and yet you bring up God. Great, Rebecca. Okay, you're right. I did bring up God. But I need to know, where are you getting the idea? I can't get into your, without more explanation from you, I don't see that you have an argument, right? I'm guessing about your argument based on what other people have argued in the past. And what I've heard other people argue in the past is that God wouldn't do it that way.
Similarity implies common descent. Similarity implies common ancestry. That is not a scientific axiom, not a scientific premise. It is a non-scientific premise.
Right. So, Black Cat, what is your scientific argument? Because we're not getting anything from this. If I don't bring God into it, I don't get, there's no argument here.
Oh, is this the same one?
Yeah, this is the same one.
Yeah, we just need more details. It's hard to spell it out with a text message, but the usual argument that evolutionists make is that genetic similarity implies common ancestry. If two things have the similar genes, similar genetics, they're more likely to share a common ancestor. That's all theory laden. You're within the theory of evolution when you're making statements like that. If evolution is true, then yeah, that's true.
Right.
But we're not assuming evolution is true.
We're trying to
be
figure
very
out
yeah,
is evolution true? What is the evidence that it is?
We're trying to stay theory neutral. Stay theory neutral in what you're saying.
Yes. Pigs Can Fly says we are more genetically in alignment with pigs and cats than with chimps when doing full genome comparisons. This is a serious problem for you.
So that's another issue which this guy may be referring to is recently new papers have come out greatly expanding the differences between humans and chimps. It used to be like 99%, and then they backed off to 98%, 97% similar, and now it's much lower than that. So it's not as similar as advertised.
Right. And I think this is in support of us to Black Hat. So now Black Hat says, okay, just a question. Are rats and mice related?
And I assume when he says related, he means have a common ancestor. And because I said earlier, he said they are related. I said, I didn't know that.
Right.
And I'll repeat, I don't know that. I don't know that they're related. Could they be related? For all I know, there could be a common ancestor there. I doubt it, just because what I know about the capabilities of mutations and natural selection. So I doubt that they're related. But I wouldn't make a hard and fast claim one way or the other. It doesn't really matter that much to me. It's not as though all of a sudden that's going to like prove evolution is true, that everything evolved. If there is some small scale change that is resulting in these different forms, these different species like rats and mice, that's not going to change all of the monumental problems, the scientific problems with the theory of evolution. I kind of doubt that rats and mice are related, simply because that would call for overcoming a lot of scientific problems. But I wouldn't, it's not something I've looked at in detail, so I'm not going to take a hard and fast statement. I will say, yeah, I would need to hear more about this from where you're coming from as to why that, because I won't speak to your position, but I will speak to many evolutionists' position who've used this line of argumentation, and you've already hinted at it in previous comments, is that God, it's what's called the infradignitatem argument, which is God wouldn't do the detailed things. He's not going to create rats and then create mice. Like, are you actually saying God would do that? Well, the Epicureans would say no, that of course not. And many, I'll call them creationists, they're naturalists who disagreed with Epicureanism. This is before Darwin. Naturalists who disagreed with Epicureanism, so they did not believe in an evolutionary worldview. They believed God created the world, yet they also believed that God would never dwell in the details, and he wouldn't create, insects and rats and mice and stuff like that. So there's been a long history of this God wouldn't dwell in the details and then to muck it up in the lowly things. And so that certainly there have been those who have used it, have been driven by that sensibility to think that rats and mice, of course, it would. And the creationists have these categories they call kinds. I'm sure you've heard of that, Rebecca, the kinds. And that may make sense and that may be true, but that also covers up this infradignitatem problem. That gets God out of the details. That allows for evolution to create, so you can have rats and mice evolving from a common ancestor. So this notion of kinds, and I don't mean to be saying it's necessarily false, but it certainly aligns very nicely with the natural religious concerns that people have that go back to the Epicureans of God mucking it up in the lowly things. God is supreme and sovereign. He should be doing the big things, and he's not going to be creating the little things. That's been a concern for thousands of years. People have always had this concern that God wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I think this argument is the one that we've been working on, is with the rats and mice versus humans and chimps. It's most frequently presented as if, like, okay, if you guys can accept that rats and mice would have a common ancestor, but humans and chimps couldn't, how do you justify that when humans and chimps are more closely related
Right,
genetically?
right. That's the
And
argument.
so it's like, well, because, and then it, so it's like, okay, well, why do I have to justify that? Like, where's
Right.
I don't, there's no problem
Exactly.
there. Like, first
Exactly.
of all, in my story, God is the one who created the chimps and the humans and the rats and the mice. And you know what? He can make them as similar as he wants to. And so there's no problem here. But there's a problem if you have an idea about how God should do things and you don't think he would do that way. And I think that is what is driving this particular argument, right? Like,
Also,
this
it's
is why
another,
they think it's a strong argument.
and it's another argument that doesn't address the central problems of evolutionary theory. Like, how
Right.
do random mutations create a mouse? How do random mutations create a rat? How do they create
Right.
a chimp? How do they create a human? Oh, that's a completely failed idea on many different levels for many different reasons. So this just kind of pushes that to the side. Let's not address the side error, and let's ask the question: well, if these two are more similar to each other, and you can accept that they evolved from a common ancestor, then why not these? Well, first of all, I don't buy the premise. I don't think chimps and humans are similar at all. They're like hugely different,
Right.
way more different than mice and rats. That's for starters. Secondly, I don't buy the idea that rats and mice have a common ancestor. Again, like I said earlier, maybe they do. That's not something I would accept easily. There'd have to be a lot of evidence for that.
Right. And I just encourage people to consider, like, if you think that could happen, try to play it out in your mind, even like try to make up a story. Look at it, spend some time looking at like a video of a rat, like just moving around doing its daily thing, and think about all of the systems just for that rat's movement, for that rat to be able to pick up a piece of food and eat it. It has to have a working digestive system. It has to have muscles and bones and all of these, and a nervous system, and it's hearing and seeing and all of these things that are taking place. Those are all incredible systems required, and they're all working together in harmony in a very compact space. And then we could even go smaller with much smaller things that have incredibly complex systems in place. Try to think about the progress of how mutations could bring that about. I don't know if anybody watched the video that I did with Jim Bob the other night, where I played the evolutionist. And, we played it out. I tried to tell him a story of how the vestibular system could come about by mutations. And so I tried to describe it. And I can tell you guys, it was really hard. And if you notice in there, I was trying to get over on him. I was trying to, like, kind of tell a quick story and let him let it pass. Okay. But I knew in my heart that this story was not working, right? I'm trying to describe how all these chemicals are coming about, but then he brings up that there has to be a, tube system in place to house these, and then there has to be connections and to other things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this by random mutation and natural selection? Guys, it's not happening. Think about that. Like, just anyway, uh, don't want to go on too long about that, but
No, that sounds like an interesting video, though.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. Really loved it. And I think we probably need to stop here. So, do you want to take any more comments, or should we close it
Are
out?
there are there good ones still?
There's so many more. It's hard to say whether they're good. I really appreciate everyone's continued participation. So,
Put up another one.
okay, put up another one. Okay. Um Kevin says God comes in the flesh. Is that flesh made of 50% human DNA and 50% godly DNA? If Jesus gave us a DNA sample, what would we find?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Um, it's not really relevant to this podcast. However, we were getting into discussions of God and so forth. So it's a fair question to say, well, wait a minute, what? So if Jesus was born and conceived as described in the Bible, then would he have 50% human DNA and 50% godly DNA? So my answer to that, Kevin, is I don't know. And the reason the reason I don't know is because it isn't revealed in the Bible. So it's really hard for me. So I would be guessing as to the nature. And I also would ask, what is the distinction between human DNA and godly DNA? So you obviously have some notion in mind that there's some distinction. And that's something I've never thought about. Like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So there's a thing. Godly DNA is a thing. And so I don't know. I don't know the question. Answer the question. How to answer that? It sounds like you're trying to poke a hole. You're trying to find like some difficult question, like a gotcha sort of thing. I figure, well, God can create the universe and can create consciousness and everything else. You can probably figure out a way to, make the DNA in Jesus.
Thank you. Okay, Titan, the official channel says, we're not telling you you have to give up your God. Just stop spreading dangerous misinformation about the science. I wanted to put this one up, and I've known Titan Uranus for quite a long time now, maybe 5 years, 6 years. And so this is in response to me saying you don't have to give up evolution to have God. So he's saying you don't have to give up your God, just stop spreading dangerous misinformation about science.
Dangerous.
That's the part I wanted to focus on. First, I want to ask, what misinformation about science have we given? Because we're trying to show you what the science actually says. So if we've given misinformation, we don't want to do that. And I would even cut it out of the video if we've said something that is wrong with the science.
It's a debating so it's another debating tactic. We have these public debates, and there are all these different tactics, and you can't let these slide when someone says something like that. So they're trying to slide that by. You're spreading dangerous misinformation. Oh, but you have to call them on that, because of course we know there was no misinformation, dangerous or other. It's a silly claim, but he wants to establish that kind of a gaslighting sort of tactic here. So you have to call them on that and force them to come clean on that. You have to specify what was the information, why was it misinformation, and not even get to the dangerous part. Just give us the misinformation.
Yeah, and let's get to the dangerous part. What is dangerous?
But you want to hype up. You want to hype up the problem. So you not only just say it's misinformation, but it's dangerous. So it's like in a court of law when you're trying to get this guy indicted for something, you make the crime worse, right? He stole something, but he did worse than that. It was terrible. Like he hit somebody, he killed somebody. You want to make it worse to get the jury more riled up, right?
And if evolution is true, or if it's false, then that's just reality, right? If it's true, that's just reality, right? Like, so we have to deal with reality, whatever it is. But I do see some actual bad effects from evolution. And, and one could say, well, there's also bad effects from religion, and that's also true. So, I could tell you why evolution is dangerous. I can give you a lot of reasons why evolution is dangerous. And you could probably give me reasons why believing in God is dangerous, and you'd be right about that, right? So it's a dangerous world, and a lot of ideas are dangerous, but don't we want to know what the truth is? Like, that's the important thing. Like, what is the truth? And if the truth is dangerous, then we'll have to do something about that danger. We'll have to do the best we can.
Which
Right?
is why I prefaced everything by saying this is uncontroversial science. We need to be able to agree on that. This is the universal language. We all know and agree and love science. If we can't agree on this, we got a problem. So everything I said was uncontroversial science. And so if somebody comes back on that and says this is misinformation, okay, we got a problem.
Right. And if there is misinformation here, please do leave me a comment in the comment section. And if I look it up and it is we were terribly wrong about something, then yeah, I'll cut it out. Please don't send me trivial things. Send me if there's something substantially wrong, okay? Because if
Or
I
better yet, he could leave a comment right now so we could see it and to back this up. I'd love to
right.
see what he means by misinformation.
Okay. So yeah, I don't see anything. I see a lot of comments from Titan, but I don't see anything about what the misinformation is. Okay, wait. Titan says, do you know why it's dangerous? Because genetics and evolution play a huge part in medicine. I
Okay.
totally disagree with this. You know what? I think evolution could disappear today. It wouldn't affect medicine or genetics at all. Those
Yeah.
are those go on just fine with no evolution. Of course, they're littered with talk about evolution because you guys are so in the paradigm that you find a way to like talk about these things in evolutionary terms, but we don't need evolution for genetics or medicine.
But there's a gaslighting action here because Titan has just jumped to the dangerous part. We need to get the misinformation part. So you can't talk about why it's dangerous without first explaining why is it misinformation. We have to understand what it is that was presented in this podcast that was misinformation. Not
Yes.
just, oh, well, you criticize evolution and that's misinformation because evolution is true.
Right. Yep. Okay. So Titan Uranus is saying you asked about the dangerous part, LOL. You asked.
No, I
Yes.
didn't. No, we said it's the misinformation part. We made that very clear. The misinformation part is what we need to know. The
The
disinformation is that evolution is
disinformation.
false. When it was okay, bingo, it's exactly what I predicted. Exactly. It's
Yeah.
misinformation because you said evolution is not likely, or you said evolution is false, or you said evolution is not a fact, or you said something bad about evolution, therefore it's misinformation. Bingo. There you go. So it's
Right.
not about the science. This isn't about the science. This is theory driven. It has to be true. And
Yes.
everything making evolution true is religious. So that is a religious comment one step removed. So he's so buried in it, he doesn't understand the, it's like someone in a cult who doesn't understand the history of the cult.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Thanks for your support and appreciate all your comments. Love talking with people about this stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.